Well, let me tell you how my dead husband's $12 million house became the battlefield where I finally fought back against the parents who threw me away like garbage. Wonderful people. Take a moment to subscribe, drop a hi, and tell us where you're joining from. Ready? Let's continue with today's story. My name is Trisha Gonzalez and I'm 34 years old. 2 months ago, I buried my husband Eugene after a sudden heart attack. 2 months of grieving in our mansion, trying to figure out how to live without the man who saved me from the streets when I was 19 and pregnant. That Tuesday morning, I was sitting in Eugene's study, staring at legal documents when the doorbell rang. Through the security camera, I saw them. My mother Diane and stepfather Robert, standing on my marble steps like they belonged there. The same people who kicked me out 15 years ago when I refused to get an abortion. "What the hell are y'all doing here?" I asked through the intercom. "Open this door, Trisha," my mother's voice crackled. "We need to talk about this house situation." House situation? My blood pressure spiked. These people hadn't spoken to me since they literally threw my belongings on the curb, screaming about how I was a disgrace to the family name. Now Eugene was gone and suddenly they wanted to talk? I opened the door anyway, curiosity overriding common sense. Diane pushed past me like she owned the place, her eyes scanning the crystal chandelier, the imported Italian marble, the original artwork lining the walls. "Damn girl," Robert whistled. "This is some serious money right here." That's when I knew. They weren't here to comfort their grieving daughter. They smelled blood in the water. "You look good, baby," my mother said, but her eyes weren't on me. They were calculating the value of everything in sight. "We heard about Eugene. Such a tragedy." I crossed my arms. "Cut the bullshit, Diane. What do you want?" She flinched at me using her first name. "Good. The woman who birthed me lost the right to be called Mama the day she chose her husband over her pregnant daughter." Robert cleared his throat, adjusting his cheap suit. "Look, Trisha, we know this is hard. But we're family. Family takes care of family." "Family?" I laughed bitterly. Where was family when I was sleeping in my car with morning sickness? Where was family when I was working 3 jobs to pay for prenatal care? Diane's expression hardened. "You made your choices. But that's water under the bridge. We're here now because blood is thicker than water. This house, this money, it's too much for one person. Especially someone who's never handled real wealth." The audacity hit me like a physical blow. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "We think it's best if we move in," Robert said casually, like he was discussing the weather. "Help you manage things. Make sure you don't make any foolish financial decisions. This place has 8 bedrooms? Plenty of space." My jaw dropped. They wanted to move into the house that Eugene and I built together. The house where we planned to raise children before we learned I couldn't have more. The house where he took his last breath in my arms. "You want to move in?" I repeated slowly. "It only makes sense," Diane continued. "We could help with the bills, the maintenance. Plus, you shouldn't be alone in your grief. Family needs to stick together during times like this." Family. That word tasted like poison in my mouth. Standing in my foyer watching these people inventory my life, I was transported back 15 years. I was 19, 3 months pregnant and terrified. I just told them about the baby, hoping for support, maybe even excitement about their first grandchild. Instead, Robert had grabbed my arm so hard it left bruises. "You're going to handle this situation and you're going to do it quietly. I won't have you embarrassing this family with your irresponsible behavior." "But I love him," I pleaded. "Troy loves me too. We want to keep the baby." "Troy Williams," my mother had screeched. "That boy from the South Side. You think he's going to marry you? You think he's going to take care of you and some bastard child?" The slap came out of nowhere. My cheek burned as I stared at my mother in shock. "You'll get rid of it or you'll get out of my house," she'd said coldly. "I won't have people talking about how I raised a slut who couldn't keep her legs closed." 3 days later, when I still refused, they literally packed my belongings in trash bags and left them on the curb. Diane had locked the deadbolt and pulled the curtains while Robert stood guard, making sure I actually left. "Trisha." Robert's voice snapped me back to the present. "Did you hear what I said?" I blinked, realizing I'd been silent for minutes, lost in the memory of that devastating betrayal. "I said we could start moving our things in this weekend. We already gave notice on our apartment." The casual assumption that I'd agree made my hands shake with rage. They'd already given notice. They'd made plans for my house, my husband's house, without even asking. You gave notice? I whispered. Of course. Family comes first. I can see you're overwhelmed, Diane said, her voice taking on that fake maternal tone I remembered from childhood. This is exactly why you need us here. You're not thinking clearly. She walked over to a family photo of Eugene and me from our wedding day, picking it up with feigned interest. He was handsome. Too bad he couldn't give you children though. At least now you have a second chance at family. The comment about children hit exactly where she intended. She knew our struggle with infertility, knew how it haunted us. Somehow she'd gathered intelligence about our most private pain and weaponized it within minutes of entering my home. How do you know about that? I asked. Oh honey, people talk. Especially when you're living this high-profile lifestyle. Your business isn't as private as you think. Robert walked over to the bar cart, helping himself to Eugene's expensive scotch like he'd been invited. The way I see it, you've been playing house in a world you don't belong in. Eugene is gone now. Time to come back to reality. Reality. I felt my temperature rising. What reality is that exactly? The reality where you're still that scared pregnant teenager who needed her parents, Diane said, setting down the photo. The reality where you're in over your head with lawyers, taxes, estate planning. The reality where you need family who actually understand your background. My background? I laughed harshly. You mean the background where my own mother called me a slut and threw me away? Diane's mask slipped slightly. I did what I had to do to teach you responsibility. Obviously it worked out since you married well. Though I hear his family never really accepted you. Another perfect strike. Eugene's family had been polite but distant, their old money sensibilities clashing with my rough origins. They'd attended our wedding but never invited me to family gatherings. After his death, they'd made their feelings clear by completely excluding me from funeral planning. See? You need us, Robert said, refilling his glass. We understand where you came from. We won't judge you for not fitting into their world. The psychological manipulation was masterful and disgusting. They were simultaneously offering comfort and reminding me of every insecurity, every place I didn't belong. But I wasn't 19 anymore. Let me get this straight, I said slowly, my voice dangerously calm. You want to move into my house, drink my husband's liquor and manage my inheritance because you think I'm too stupid and traumatized to handle it myself. We didn't say stupid, Diane protested. You didn't have to. I walked over to the security tablet on the wall, pulling up footage from the past hour. But let me show you what you did say. I rewound to their conversation while I was in the kitchen getting water. On screen, Robert's voice came through clearly. This is even better than we thought. She's completely lost without him. We could probably get her to sign over power of attorney within a month. And the best part, Diane's recorded voice added, is she doesn't have anyone else. No kids, no real friends, his family hates her. She's desperate for family connection. We can use that. Robert choked on his scotch. Trisha, that's not, we were just what? Just planning how to manipulate me into giving you control of my dead husband's money. I turned off the recording. In my house, drinking his scotch, while I'm upstairs grieving. The silence stretched between us. Finally, Diane straightened her shoulders, dropping all pretense of maternal concern. Fine. You want to play hardball? Let's talk facts. You have no legal family except us. When you die, everything goes to next of kin. We're your next of kin, Trisha. This house, this money, it's going to be ours eventually anyway. Eventually. I repeated. Well, she shrugged. Accidents happen. Young widows living alone in big houses. It's dangerous. People get ideas. Break-ins, home invasions. Terrible things. The threat hung in the air like poison gas. My own mother had just implied that my life was expendable, that they were already planning for my death. That's when something inside me snapped. Get out, I said quietly. Excuse me. Robert set down his glass. I said get the fuck out of my house. Right now. Diane laughed. Or what? You'll call the police? And tell them what? That your parents came to visit during your time of grief. He thought she had me. They both did. In their minds, I was still that powerless teenager with nowhere to go. They couldn't conceive that I might have learned something during 15 years of marriage to a brilliant businessman. I pulled out my phone and hit speed dial. Hi Troy. It's Trisha. I need you at the house immediately. Yes, the house. Bring the restraining order paperwork we discussed. Troy Williams. The boy they'd dismissed as worthless from the South Side. The father of the child they'd forced me to abort. Who was now one of the city's most successful civil rights attorneys and, as of 6 months ago, my divorce lawyer when I'd briefly considered leaving Eugene during a rough patch. We'd reconciled, but the legal relationship remained. Troy Williams. Diane's face went pale. Your high school boyfriend? My attorney, I corrected. Who happens to have very detailed files about parental abandonment, emotional abuse, and extortion attempts against vulnerable widows. Robert stood up abruptly. Now hold on. We're just trying to help family. Family. I screamed, letting 15 years of buried rage explode. Where was family when I miscarried at 20 because I couldn't afford proper medical care? Where was family when I worked 16-hour days to put myself through community college? Where was family when I married a man I barely knew because he was the first person to show me kindness? My voice echoed through the marble foyer. You threw me away like garbage and now you want to come back because you smell money. You want to move into the house built with love you never showed me, off the success you never believed I could achieve. Diane tried to interrupt, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished. You threatened my life in my own home. You recorded yourselves planning to manipulate me. You assumed I was still that broken teenager you destroyed. The front door opened and Troy walked in with 2 associates and a briefcase. Even at 45, he was still strikingly handsome, his success evident in his tailored suit and confident bearing. Tricia, he said gently, then turned cold eyes toward my parents. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson. Troy, I said, my voice steadying. Please explain to these people exactly what happens to individuals who attempt to extort widows during the probate process. Troy opened his briefcase with theatrical precision. Extortion, fraud, conspiracy to commit elder abuse, which applies to vulnerable adults of any age, and making terroristic threats. In this state, the combination carries a minimum sentence of 15 years. Elder abuse? Robert sputtered. She's 34. Financially vulnerable adult experiencing grief trauma, Troy corrected smoothly. The law specifically protects people in Trish's situation from exactly this type of predatory behavior by family members. He pulled out a thick folder. Especially when those family members have a documented history of abandonment and abuse. Oh yes, we have records. The hospital reports from when you threw a pregnant teenager out of your home. The police reports from when neighbors called about the screaming. The social services investigation that you somehow talked your way out of. Diane's face went ashen. Those records were sealed. Civil rights violations don't have statute of limitations, Troy replied. Especially when new crimes are committed. Like breaking and entering. We didn't break in. Robert protested. She let us in. After you trespassed on private property, which was recorded by multiple security cameras. Troy nodded toward the surveillance system. Along with your lovely conversation about manipulating Mrs. Gonzalez into signing over power of attorney, your threats about accidents happening to young widows, and your admission that you're only here for the money. I watched my parents' confidence crumble in real time. They'd walked into my house thinking they were dealing with the same powerless girl they'd discarded. Instead, they'd stumbled into a carefully laid legal trap. How did you? Diane started. I've been expecting you, I said simply. Eugene told me that when he died, every vulture in both our families would come circling. He made sure I was prepared. Troy has been on retainer for 2 months, just waiting for you to show up and incriminate yourselves. This is entrapment. Robert shouted. No, Troy smiled coldly. This is consequence. As if on cue, another car pulled into the driveway. Through the window, I saw Eugene's sister Elizabeth getting out of her Mercedes, looking determined and elegant as always. Oh, perfect timing, I muttered. Elizabeth had never liked me and I wasn't in the mood for more family drama. But when she walked in, she didn't look at me with her usual cool disdain. Instead, she stared at my parents with pure disgust. Are these the parasites? She asked Troy directly. Elizabeth. I was confused. What are you doing here? She turned to me, and for the first time in 8 years of knowing each other, her expression was warm. Oh honey. I'm sorry it took me so long to get here. I was in court when Troy called. Troy called you. Eugene made me promise, she said softly. If anything happened to him, I was to make sure you were protected from your family. He told me what they did to you, how they threw you out when you were pregnant. He made me swear that if they ever showed up, I'd help you fight them. I stared at her in shock. Elizabeth had barely spoken to me at family gatherings. I'd assumed she saw me as a gold digger who'd trapped her beloved brother. You always thought I hated you, she said, reading my expression. I didn't. I was jealous. Eugene loved you in a way I'd never seen him love anyone. He'd talk for hours about how strong you were, how you'd survived things that would have destroyed other people. He said you were the bravest person he knew. Tears stung my eyes. He said that. He said you were a fighter who'd been beaten down so many times you'd forgotten how to fight back. But that you'd remember when you needed to. She looked at my parents with contempt. Looks like he was right. Diane tried one last manipulation. Trisha, these people are turning you against your own family. We're your blood. Blood. Elizabeth laughed harshly. You threw your pregnant daughter into the street. My brother found her living in her car, working 3 jobs, afraid to go to the hospital when she miscarried because she couldn't pay. She was 19 years old and you destroyed her. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock. Wait, I said slowly, a horrible realization creeping in. Elizabeth, how do you know about the miscarriage? I never told Eugene about losing the baby. Elizabeth exchanged a look with Troy, who nodded grimly. Trisha, Troy said gently, there's something else. Something Eugene discovered right before he died, something that made him change his will to include additional protections. He pulled out another folder. He hired a private investigator to look into your family history. He wanted to understand what had traumatized you so badly. What he found. Troy's jaw clenched. Show her the report, Elizabeth. With shaking hands, Elizabeth handed me a manila envelope. Inside were photographs, medical records, and a private investigator's report dated just 3 weeks before Eugene's death. The first page made my blood turn to ice. Insurance fraud? I whispered. Your stepfather took out life insurance policies on you when you turned 18, Troy explained. Multiple policies, all with him as beneficiary. When you got pregnant and they threw you out, they were hoping you'd die. The miscarriage, the poverty, the stress, they were counting on it killing you so they could collect. I stared at Robert, who couldn't meet my eyes. You insured my life? While I was living in my car. When that didn't work, Elizabeth continued, her voice shaking with rage, they filed a fraudulent death certificate claiming you died in an accident. They collected over $300,000 from 4 different insurance companies. The room spun around me. They declared me dead? That's why you had so much trouble getting credit, getting jobs, getting benefits, Troy said. Officially, Trisha Johnson died 15 years ago. They collected the money and moved to another state. I looked at my mother, who was now crying. You collected money for my death? While I was out there struggling, grieving our lost baby, you were cashing checks from my fake funeral. We needed the money, Diane whispered. Robert lost his job and you were gone anyway. We thought you'd never find out. Find out? I screamed. You committed federal fraud. You collected death benefits while I was alive. You made me a ghost in the system. Suddenly everything made sense. Why I'd had to use Eugene's connections to get proper identification when we got married. Why certain background checks had come back strange. Why I'd always felt like I was living someone else's life. Because according to the government, I'd been dead for 15 years. So let me understand this completely, I said, my voice deadly calm as I stared at these people who shared my DNA. You threw your pregnant daughter out of the house. When that didn't kill me fast enough for your liking, you literally erased me from existence and collected money for my death. And now that you've spent that money, you want to move into my house and take my inheritance. Trisha, please, my mother begged. We can explain. No. I stood up, feeling stronger than I had in months. You can't explain. There is no explanation for declaring your own child dead for money. There is no explanation for hoping I would die so you could profit. There is no explanation for any of this. I turned to Troy. What's the penalty for insurance fraud? Federal crime. 20 years minimum when multiple companies are involved. Plus restitution, which with interest would be close to $1 million now. Robert lurched forward. Now wait just a damn minute. We never meant for it to go this far. We just needed help getting back on our feet. By dancing on my grave, I finished. While I was out there struggling to survive, you were literally celebrating my death and spending the money. Elizabeth placed a supportive hand on my shoulder. Eugene suspected something like this. He said your family's rejection was too complete, too cruel. Normal people don't completely abandon their children without some kind of financial motivation. I walked over to the window looking out at the garden Eugene and I had planned together. 2 months ago, I'd been a grieving widow, lost and alone. Now I discovered I'd been legally dead for half my life, while the people who were supposed to love me most had profited from my supposed corpse. But instead of feeling broken, I felt free. You want to know the funny thing? I said, turning back to face them. I spent 15 years hating myself for not being worthy of your love. 15 years thinking I'd done something so terrible that my own mother could throw me away. I let that pain shape everything. My relationship with Eugene, my relationship with his family, my entire sense of self-worth. I laughed and it felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. But you didn't abandon me because I wasn't good enough. You abandoned me because I was worth more to you dead than alive. Troy, I said, my decision crystallizing with perfect clarity. I want them prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Federal fraud, conspiracy, attempted extortion. Everything. Trisha, no, Diane pleaded. We're your parents. We made mistakes, but... Mistakes. I laughed again, the sound echoing off the marble walls. Declaring your child dead isn't a mistake. It's a calculated decision to commit fraud while hoping that child actually dies. I walked over to the security panel and pulled up recordings from their entire visit. Elizabeth, as Eugene's estate executor, would you please confirm that these people have no legal claim to any part of his estate? None whatsoever, she said firmly. In fact, given their fraudulent actions against you, any previous claims they might have had are now void. The will specifically states that anyone who attempts to defraud or harm you is permanently disinherited from any future considerations. Future considerations? Robert asked. Oh, did I forget to mention? I smiled sweetly. Eugene left a provision in his will. If anything happened to me within the first 5 years of his death, a full investigation would be triggered, and anyone found responsible would face both criminal and civil penalties. But he also set aside money for my biological family, if they proved worthy of it. I let that sink in before continuing. There was a trust fund. $2 million set aside specifically for Diane Johnson and whatever dependents she might have. All you had to do was come here, offer genuine condolences and ask for help like normal people. The color drained from both their faces. $2 million. Diane whispered. $2 million. Gone now, of course. The trust specifically states that any criminal activity, fraud, or attempts to harm me would result in the money being donated to organizations that help abandoned pregnant teenagers. I pulled out my phone. Which reminds me, I should probably call them and let them know they're getting a rather substantial donation. The shelter where I stayed when you threw me out is going to be very excited. Robert collapsed into a chair. We lost $2 million? You lost everything, I corrected. Your freedom, your dignity, your daughter, and your future. All because you couldn't be decent human beings for one conversation. The irony was perfect. They'd thrown away millions because they were too greedy and cruel to wait for millions. Officers, they're right here, Troy said as police entered through the front door. Apparently he'd called them while we were talking. You'll find all the evidence you need in these files. As I watched my parents being read their rights, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 15 years. Complete freedom from their hold over me. Mrs. Gonzalez, one of the officers said, we'll need a statement, but we have enough evidence to proceed with charges immediately. Thank you, officer. I'll be down to the station tomorrow morning. After they were gone, Elizabeth, Troy, and I sat in Eugene's study, the silence broken only by the gentle ticking of his antique clock. How do you feel? Elizabeth asked. I considered the question carefully. Lighter. Like I've been carrying invisible chains for 15 years and they just fell off. Eugene would be proud, she said softly. He always said you were stronger than you knew. Troy poured himself a scotch, the same bottle Robert had helped himself to earlier. What will you do now? Live, I said simply. For the first time since I was 19, I'm going to live without looking over my shoulder, wondering when the people who should love me most are going to hurt me next. I walked over to Eugene's desk, where a framed photo of us at our first anniversary dinner sat next to his reading glasses. Eugene saved me once when I was young and broken and afraid. But I think maybe he saved me twice. Once when he married me and once when he made sure I'd be strong enough to save myself. Elizabeth smiled, and for the first time, it reached her eyes when she looked at me. Welcome to the family, Trisha. The real family. You know what the craziest part is? I said. They could have had everything they wanted just by being decent. Love, money, family, security, it was all right here waiting for them. All they had to do was be parents. But they couldn't. And now, finally, I was free to become the person I was meant to be without their poison in my veins. 6 months later, I stood in the garden Eugene and I had planned, watching children from the New Hope Pregnancy Center play on the swing set we'd had installed. The center now occupied the east wing of our house, my house, providing shelter and support for pregnant teenagers who'd been abandoned by their families. Miss Trisha, little Aisha called out, running over with a dandelion. Look what I found. That's beautiful, sweetheart, I said, accepting the flower. At 7 months pregnant and only 17, Aisha reminded me of myself at that age. But she wouldn't spend a single night in her car or wonder where her next meal was coming from. Troy walked over, looking relaxed in jeans and a t-shirt, a far cry from his courtroom attire. The sentencing hearing is next week. They're looking at 15 years each plus full restitution. Good, I said simply. I felt no satisfaction in their punishment, but I felt no guilt either. They'd made their choices. Elizabeth appeared on the terrace, carrying a tray of lemonade for the kids. She'd become my closest friend and the sister I'd never had. The adoption agency called. They want to know if you're still interested in being matched with expectant mothers who want to choose their baby's family. I looked around at the life I was building. Not the life Eugene had given me, but the life I was creating from the foundation of his love. The house was full of laughter, purpose, and hope. Young women who'd been thrown away by their families were finding safety here. Babies who might have been born into poverty were finding loving homes through our program. Yes, I said, feeling complete for the first time in my life. I'm interested. As if on cue, my phone rang. The adoption counselor's voice was excited. Trisha, we have a 19-year-old girl whose parents kicked her out when they found out she was pregnant. She specifically requested to meet you. She said she wants her baby to go to someone who understands what it's like to be abandoned but who found their way to happiness anyway. I closed my eyes, feeling Eugene's presence in the warm afternoon sun. He'd known exactly what he was doing when he built all these safeguards into his estate. He'd known I'd need to not just survive my family's betrayal, but transform it into something beautiful. Tell her yes, I said. Tell her she's safe now. And for the first time since I was 19 years old, I truly believed those words. For her and for myself. My parents had tried to erase me for money. Instead, they'd freed me to become exactly who I was meant to be. Someone who turns pain into purpose, trauma into triumph, and abandonment into abundance. The scared little girl living in her car was finally, truly home. Looking back, maybe I should have seen this coming and handled it better from the start. But in the moment, this felt like my only option. What would you have done differently?